of course prearranged by the book. So e4, e6, d4, d5, e5, and b6. So not c5 but b6. Now what is this move? This is the sideline. Maybe not everybody knows, however I play it from time to time, so I know some ideas. So first of all, what is the idea? In the advanced system in French defense, white gonna have very important piece and very strong piece, bishop on d3, and this bishop is just deadly. It supports the march of these pawns, so these pawns can advance and, you know, destroy the French defense. So that is the one thing. Also it's pointing at h7, so it can be very, very dangerous. It's definitely one of the best pieces of white. From the other hand, black has the very weak French bishop, and it's also light square bishop. So the idea of b6 is to early exchange these bishops. That would be, you know, dream scenario. So we start, this is out of the book now, and Stockfish plays c3, which is the main move. And why it's the main move? Because now bishop on a6 is not possible, because that would be terrible blunder, because after exchanging, the queen can do a little tactic with the attack on the king and of course on the knight. So this is the problem. What usually is played here is queen on d7 to prevent that. And then, for example, after knight on f3, knight on e7, waiting move, waiting for moving the bishop. And once the bishop is moved, for example, to d3, this bishop can move with the tempo, exchange the bishop, and continue the game. However, white usually answer with some waiting move as well, so knight on a3 still developing, so black sooner or later gonna play bishop on a6, and then, for example, h5, knight on f5, and the game can continue. So these are the main ideas. Bishop on a6, now exchange the bishops and continue. However, here Lila Chess 0 first plays c5, and now we have knight a3, with of course with the idea this bishop can now jump to b5. We have queen on d7, and now bishop on b5 as planned. And now the problem is the bishop can't be really moved to a6, because, you know, this is quite nasty pin, so black are actually forced to play knight on c6. We have knight on f3 by Stockfish, and now a6, kicking the bishop, and bishop on d3. So very important diagonal for white. So it looks like black didn't achieve what they could achieve here. However, the game is still very, very interesting, because Lila plays f6, very French move, undermining all this powerful center and very annoying center. Stockfish castles, and now we have exchange on e5. So f takes on e5, and now knight takes on e5. However, maybe d takes on e5 could be slightly better, because black would have more pieces to develop, and black doesn't have much space here. However, also after knight on e5, white in the future can play f4 much easier. We have knight on e5, d takes on e5, and now knight on e7, of course with the idea of developing to c6 and attack the pawn on e5. We have queen on f3 by Stockfish, so developing the queen on the king side is pretty common idea. And now knight on c6 with the pressure, with the attack on e5 pawn. Queen on g3, and for now the queen is actually hired as the bodyguard of the pawn on e5. And maybe even waiting for some move, you know, for example, bishop on e7 cannot be played because this pawn is hanging, and also g6 wouldn't be that great, because after a bishop on g5, white actually can play on the dark squares. Black would probably be forced to exchange the dark square bishop and continue the game. However, probably that's not the greatest idea, because Lila Chess 0 has completely different plan. So definitely not gonna castle on the king side. That would be a suicide with the queen already on the g file, with the you know, the bishops, you know, watching on the king side as well. That's definitely bad idea. So bishop on b7. We have knight on c2. So this knight now gonna move somewhere else. And castle by Lila Chess 0. And here Probably b4 would be the best here. b4, even sacrifice the pawn, because taking that pawn is not so great for black. For example, c takes on b4, c takes on b4, knight on b4, and look at this king. The king is on the open c file, and it's quite vulnerable. So here, for example, knight on b4, bishop on b4, the game of course can continue. However, white gonna have quite a lot of play, and black doesn't have, you know, so safe position. However, Stockfish play rook on b1, quite slow move, and now preparing b4. And now Lila found a really beautiful idea. Look at this, very nice positional understanding, if we can say that, of Lila, of this position. So we have b5, and after b4 we have c4, and the idea is after bishop on e2, because the bishop is of course under attack, d4, and now c takes on d4, otherwise the d3 is a huge threat. So c takes on d4, and now of course don't take this pawn, okay? Lila don't want to win back the material. That was the sacrifice. However, black gonna have this powerful protected passed pawn, and white gonna have this pawn, which is a weakness, and Lila can take it in the future. So that is the idea. Knight on d4 would be just bad, because after knight on d4, queen on d4, look at this, bishop g5 with the attack on the rook, so rook has to be moved, and then bishop on g4 with all of this pressure. It's a very, very dangerous. Actually, if the rook takes the pawn, and then another rook comes to d1, and look at this. This is very, very dangerous. Also, if the queen takes on e5, it's not really better, because the bishop can come to f4, then the rook can attack the queen and put the pressure on this pawn, and it's very dangerous. The king is completely, you know, vulnerable. So opening the position here, it's a very bad idea. So Lila continues the plan of improving the position and plays knight on e7. Now, what is the idea? You already probably see the knight want to jump to d5, and then what? So you will see what is the idea. We have rook on d1, giving some extra protection to d4, which is very vulnerable, and now g5. So the idea is to actually roll the pawns on the king side, attack there, and also create very interesting outpost. And now look at this. This knight can jump to d5, and here that would be beautiful outpost together with the bishop attacking on g2. Maybe the rook can join, especially if the pawn is taken. So for example, bishop on g5, and look at this, rook g8, and this is just bad. h6 is coming. This attack is a very dangerous, and that would be very bad for white. So what Stockfish did after g5, knight on e3, controlling d5, and now we have knight on d5. So of course this is one threat, this is another threat, you know, forking the rooks. So this knight would be, you know, monster knight. So Stockfish decide to exchange. There is not much choice here, so knight on d5 and bishop on d5, and this bishop is so powerful, it looks like it works as a pawn. However, what a pawn, watching at g2 and controlling couple of light squares. And now h5 is another threat, and these pawns, you know, gonna roll an attack on the king side. So what white did is bishop h5, very nice move by Stockfish. Now h5 is not possible, so Lila plays queen on c6. We have h3, preventing any g4 move, making some you know, breathing space for the king, and now bishop on e7. Developing the bishop, connecting the rooks, and now rook on b2. Rook on b2, preparing to actually double the rooks somewhere if needed, and also watching an f2. So this f2 can be a target because we have semi-open f file. We have rook d on f8. and now a3, consolidating the position here. However, the main idea is bring the rook to a2 and then push a4, open the a file, and maybe make some counterplay on the a file. So very nice idea by Stockfish. We have rook on f5, preparing to double the rooks on the f file, and now rook on a2. But look at this rook. This rook actually came from a1 through b1, b2, a2, just to support the attack on the queen side. Pretty amazing, because this rook could stay actually on the a file, and b4 could be played before, probably with the same effect. We have a king on b7, so bringing the king closer to the a file, just to control in the case if the a file is open. We have a rook on f1, bringing the support to f2, as the f2 can be actually attacked more times. And now rook on g8, attacking on the king side and preparing g4. Queen on g4, now blocking the pawn. So Lila goes for rook on a8. And now Lila is threatening to play a5, maybe open the file, maybe even play a4 and close the position and concentrate on the king side. There are a lot of ways. So bishop on d2, just to prevent any a5 moves. And now we have rook a on f8, concentrating on the semi-open f file. And now a4 is completely not possible. It looks like, okay, I could play a4, open the file, maybe double the rooks there, and it looks pretty good. However, after a4 we could have c3, and it's difficult to stop that pawn. For example, rook on c2 is an option, and now the bishop cannot be taken because of the pin. However, bishop on b4, and this pawn gonna be very dangerous, and black gonna have, you know, a lot of dangerous gameplay here with these bishops, you know, controlling these diagonals, the rooks controlling the semi-open f file. It's a pretty good. Bishop on e3 of course can be played, solidifying the position, but it's still difficult. Even this bishop can come to c4 and continue many ways. Black gonna have, you know, much better position. So we have rook on c2, probably against these c3 moves, so just preventing. But now Lila chess 0 play a5, so deciding to open a file, or maybe, as I said, a4. a4 would be deadly, because all the black pieces are actually concentrated on the king side, and this king would be ultra safe over there. So Stockfish doesn't have much choice and make very ugly move, but without, you know, much choice. B takes on f5, and now bishop a3. So black gonna have this powerful connected passed pawn. So this is what Lila did in French defense. We have queen on g3, attacking the bishop now. Bishop retreat to e7, and now b4 of course is a threat. So we have rook on b2 against that move, and now king on a6. And this king is the safest king ever, because the shelter is white, so it cannot be attacked by the white pieces, you know, on the a file. We have bishop on g4, attacking the rook. Rook goes back to a 7 rank, and now bishop h5, making maybe threefold repetition. Lila 0 is not interested. Rook on g7. We have rook f on b1, putting a lot of pressure now on b5 pawn, and now rook on b8, supporting and also threatening b4. So bishop on b4, blocking that, and here Lila chess 0 plays another beautiful move, g4. g4. The point is that the bishop of course cannot take the pawn, because first exchange the dark square bishops and then play h5, winning the piece and of course the game, so it's not possible. So we have h takes on g4. The downside of this move, look at this bishop. This bishop is completely locked, cut off from the rest of the white army, and doesn't support anything. So Stockfish is again in the little positional troubles. We have bishop on e4 now, attacking the rook. So rook has to be moved. Probably rook on d1 could be the better option. The problem is it's defending the d4, which is very important. However, this pawn can march. So it's very difficult to actually decide where to move the rook. Rook on c1 was played. And here, after this move, evaluation started to be in favor of Lila. So far, it was more or less it was in favor of Stockfish. However, here Lila chess 0 has already advantage -1.5, so in favor of Lila. We have rook on d8 attacking the pawn on d4, and now how to defend that? If white decide to move the rooks, then they cannot block the pawns, and these pawns can be very, very annoying and deadly. So first, bishop on e7, exchanging the dark square bishops, and now rook on e7. And here Stockfish decided, okay, this pawn is more important, so queen on e3, and we have bishop on g2, so giving up this pawn, and now g5, locking the pawn on h7, but also this bishop is free. So it took a couple of moves actually to free that bishop. However, black at that time improved the position, won one of the pawns, and now just retreat to d5. So solidifying the position, and now f4. So Stockfish tries to counterplay on the king side, because so far didn't have any counterplay, and black had the initiative and still have the initiative. But you know, Stockfish try to, you know, distract and play some counterplay. We have rook on b7, preparing b4, and now king on f2. Maybe rook c on b1 could be better, because it would stop for the moment the advancement of the pawn. However, sooner or later it would come. So b4, and now bishop on e2, pinning the pawn. We have rook on c8, and now f5, distracting on the king side. E takes on f5. And now rook b on c2, so concentrating all the forces on the c4. We have queen on b5, moving away from the pin, but also, you know, this is another pin. So we have e6. Now the pawn is marching and it cannot be taken because has the support of the queen. So Lila plays f4, distracting move, and of course if the pawn is taken, then this pawn gonna be lost. So queen on e5, and now b3, attacking the rook. Rook on b2, and now f3, attacking the bishop, so distracting the bishop. The problem is, if the bishop goes on f3, then black just simply exchange everything. So bishop on f3, the queen is under attack, so queen on b5 is forced, rook on b5, king on f3, and this is completely winning for black. The king can actually go to b4, this pawn can just roll, and also black can pick up this pawn, can pick up actually this pawn as well. So it's completely winning ending for black. So it's not even possible. This is why we have bishop on d3. Little tactic, because the bishop cannot be taken because the rook on c8 is hanging. So a king on a7, just retreating from this ugly pin. And now we have a6. So Stockfish follows the king and asking to open the A file. Of course, it's not in the best interest of black. So now very calmly rook b on b8. We have queen on g7 with check, and now king on a8. And here queen on d7, asking to exchange the queens, which Lila accepts. So we have queen on d7, e takes on d7, and now simply rook on c6, attacking this pawn. But also this bishop can be taken now because there are no tactics anymore. So white has to move, and bishop on h7, it looks pretty good. However, it's not that great. For example, rook on a6, and after, let's say, rook on e1 and trying to advance this pawn, these pawns are just too powerful. So for example, rook on d6, moving the rook behind, always move the rook behind the pawns. So bishop f5, defending, but then c3, and this pawn's gonna roll and win the game. So rook b on b1, c2, rook b2, rook b7, now concentrating on d7, and white can deliver maybe one check here, and but they cannot, you know, advance, because after king on a7, if they advance, black of course gonna take that queen and you know, create the queen on its own. So rook on a1 probably, but black even can actually take this pawn, eliminate that, and white gonna have two rooks, which works as a blockers, and this bishop controls f3, controls b3 as well, and this rook is just free, can pick up the pieces on the board, the king can come and win the game. So it just doesn't work. This is why Stockfish decided to go for the pretty bad endings, however didn't see another option, so we have bishop on c4, and now of course rook on c4, and now rook on b3. So 2 pawns for the bishop, and these rooks cannot be taken because of the pawn. So of course that would be losing. Okay, you cannot take this rook. You cannot also take this rook because for exactly the same reason that is just losing. So we have rook on d8 by Lila chess 0, and now rook on c4, bishop on c4, and now rook on f3. So we have the end game. Now here maybe rook on c3 could be played, but then simply bishop on a6, and this just doesn't work, okay, because the bishop controls c4, c8, so it doesn't work. King f3, rook d7, it's completely winning for black. So this is why we have rook on f3, but it is still winning for black. So what is the idea? The idea is to defend this pawn. It's very important pawn, and this pawn gonna win the game, and just pick up the pawns. Look at these pawns. They are so easy actually to pick up. They don't have the support, and only the rook and the king can support them. So rook on d7, picking up the first pawn. So 3 more to go. We have king on e3 by Stockfish, and now bishop on f7 with the plan, of course, defending on h7. King on d3, and now king on a7 attacking the pawn. So rook on f6, and now bishop on g6 with check. King on c4, and now bishop on e4, controlling d5 and also d3. So now the king can be kicked. We have rook on f4, and now as planned rook on c7, king on b4, and now bishop on d3 with the attack on a6. It actually cannot be saved, so we have d5, bishop on a6, so 2 pawns down, and now just 2 more to go. We have rook on f3, and now king on b7, rook on g3 with the idea of pushing this pawn and maybe exchange for the black pawn. So that would be of course very close to draw. We have rook on g7 preventing, and now king on c5, king on c7, king on d4, king on d6, and now rook on h3 with the idea of course to win the bishop. Very nice skewer. So bishop on c8 with the idea of bringing the bishop back to actually to g6, which would free the rook from the duties on g7, and now rook h6 anyway, so kicking the king on e7, and now king on e4, so the bishop cannot come to f5 anymore, but now we have king on f8, rook on c6 attacking the bishop, so bishop on d7, and now rook on h6, rook on e7 with check, now king on d4, and now king on g7. So now the king is the guardian of h7, so the pawn is safe. So the plan for black now is just to exchange the rooks, and once the rooks are exchanged, the king can actually pick up these 2 pawns and win, because keep in mind the bishop is the light square bishop, and it's very, very important. Because you know promotion square is the light square as well, so otherwise that would be a draw. So here is the idea: exchange the rooks now. We have rook on f6 by Stockfish, and now rook on f7, asking maybe you want to lose now. We have rook on b6, and now bishop on g4. King on e5, and now rook f5 and picking up just another pawn. King on e4 and rook on g5, so only 1 pawn left. Rook on b7 with check, king on g6, rook on b6, king h5, rook on b7, and now h6, so moving the pawn, and here rook on b2, trying to stop from the front. We have bishop on c8, and now king on d4. King on g6, just making a way for this pawn, and this pawn simply gonna win the game. We have couple of more moves, so rook on b6, and now king on h7, rook on b3, and now rook on g4 with check, king on c5, and now rook on g7. So making couple of moves, probably not necessary, but you know that the engines, they make a lot of strange moves. We have king on d4, and now rook on b7, asking to exchange the rooks again, rook on a3, and now rook on d7, rook on b3, bishop on b7, attacking the pawn twice. We have a rook on b5, and now exchanging would be too early, because that would be a draw. White would be on time to go to the corner and draw the game. So first king on g6, and after rook on b6, king g5, and in this position Stockfish just resign, and it resigns because after rook on b5 now it's the right time to exchange, and after exchanging king f4, and this pawn gonna of course advance, promote, and win the game. So what a game in this position. Actually, Lila Chess 0 in advanced French defense just, you know, outplayed Stockfish, and Stockfish didn't even have the a little chances for any counterplay. Just try something, but at the end in the completely lost position where Lila already dominated. So it seems like, you know, French defense, it's still playable. It was crushed by Lila, but when Lila actually played French defense, it's also a very, very powerful tool. So it's good news for all the French defense users that everything is okay with that defense. So yeah, that's all for today. If you like this game, press like. If for some reason you don't like it, press unlike. And if you don't want to miss any other quality content from the current tournament, from the engines games, and from the, you know, very educational games from the past, press subscribe, smash the bell button. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.